Hey guys, tonight we're heading somewhere warm, ancient, and a little strange in the best way. Picture soft cicadas humming in the olive trees, the golden light of late afternoon flickering through crooked stone alleys, and the smell of thyme dust and sea salt in the air. I know it already sounds like a travel video, but this isn't a vacation. This was a whole summer. A weird, funny, unforgettable summer. And you might not have experienced this before, but sometimes your best friend isn't a person. Sometimes it's a goat. If that feels a little odd, trust me, you'll understand soon. Just get cozy. Maybe wrap yourself in a soft blanket and settle in. If you enjoy these quiet bedtime stories, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the little bell so you never miss a new diary entry. All right, now let's get into today's diary entry. So the story starts in a tiny village in Greece. I couldn't even pronounce its full name until I was maybe 12. My grandparents lived there in a squat white house covered in vines that always smelled like lemon peels and smoke. I must have been around 9 or 10 the first time we stayed the entire summer. My parents were both teachers, so when school let out, we packed up and flew across the ocean for a whole season. The village felt like it was built by hand, stone by stone. The streets were made of uneven cobbles, polished smooth from centuries of sandals. Everyone knew everyone, and I don't just mean names, I mean their habits, their nicknames, who was secretly related to who, and exactly how many olives someone had picked last year. The local grocer still weighed fruit on one of those old brass balance scales with little weights like you see in museums. When we arrived, it was hot in that buzzing, sleepy way that makes dogs lie in the shade with their tongues hanging out. The house had no air conditioning, just thick stone walls, wooden shutters, and a single fan that rattled like it had stage fright. I shared a room with my cousin Theo, who was 2 years older and convinced he knew everything. He didn't. But he could catch lizards with one hand, and he knew which trees had sour green apples you could eat if you didn't mind puckering so hard your ears rang. Every morning we'd get up before the sun really started to bake the earth, and we'd wander off. Sometimes down by the well where the frogs were always louder than you remembered. Sometimes up the hill where the old ruins sat like broken teeth above the olive groves. But one morning something changed. I woke up earlier than usual. It was still a bit dark. You know that quiet just before the sun stretches into the sky? That's when I heard it. A small, curious sound. Not quite a bleat, more like a soft huff. I pulled open the shutter and looked out the window. There, standing like a misplaced sock in the courtyard, was a tiny goat. White with little black patches on her ears, just nibbling on a dry fig leaf like she had all the time in the world. At first I thought she belonged to someone. Everyone had animals in the village, chickens, cats, sometimes a donkey tied up behind a shed. But this goat had no rope, no bell, no sign of ownership. She just looked up at me with these eyes golden curious, like she'd been waiting specifically for me to wake up. I didn't think much of it. I went downstairs, grabbed a piece of leftover bread, and headed out like always. The goat followed me, all the way through the alley, past the grocer, up the hill. At first I thought it was a fluke, but when I ducked behind a tree to test her, she peeked around the trunk 5 seconds later, chewing thoughtfully. Theo thought it was hilarious. "She's your shadow now," he said, throwing a pebble down the hill. I called her Eleni after my great aunt, who also had a tendency to follow people around and stare at them silently. We didn't feed her, not much anyway. Goats eat everything, or at least they try. She nibbled old socks, crumpled receipts, and once even tried to chew the strap off my sandal. But mostly she just existed beside me, like a very quiet, slightly judgmental sibling. My grandmother said we should tie her up before someone claimed her, but nobody ever came for her. She wasn't tagged, didn't look branded, and no one in the village mentioned missing a goat. By the end of that week, she was ours, or maybe we were hers. I remember one afternoon I was lying in the shade reading a comic book. Eleni came over, plopped down beside me, and started chewing on the corner of the page. I didn't even stop her. It felt right somehow. It was a slow, shimmering beginning to a very peculiar friendship. The next morning, she was already waiting for me by the door. Eleni, like she'd always belonged there, nestled between the cracked stones and the sleepy lavender bushes that lined the courtyard. She didn't make any noise, just stared, blinking slowly like goats do when they're pretending not to judge you. I tried to sneak past her, not because I didn't like her, but because I want to see if she'd really follow me again. I tiptoed out, walked quickly around the fig tree and peeked over my shoulder. There she was, a few steps behind, pretending to sniff the ground like she just happened to be headed in the same direction. From that moment, it was official. Eleni had adopted me. She followed me everywhere, not just through the olive groves or up to the old ruins. She followed me into the center of town, which is where things started getting interesting. You see, the town square in that little Greek village wasn't very large, but it was the center of everything. There was the bakery that sold sesame rings so warm they burned your hands, a tiny shop with jars of olives floating like prehistoric eggs, and a statue of some ancient hero who was probably far less heroic than the pigeons sitting on his head made him look. Market day happened twice a week. The square filled up with wooden carts and folding tables, and women shouting over each other about whose tomatoes were sweeter. It was beautiful chaos. I wasn't supposed to bring animals into the square, but Eleni didn't believe in rules. The first time it happened, I'd gone to buy 2 peaches and a newspaper for my grandfather. I tied Eleni's makeshift leash, a bit of old rope, to a post outside the bakery. I even gave her a little wave before going in. 5 minutes later, I was trying to choose between slightly bruised peaches when I heard a scream, then a crash, then the unmistakable sound of hooves on tile. Eleni had broken free. She wasn't galloping, more like confidently trotting, but she was absolutely making her rounds. Past the bread stall, past the woman selling oregano bundles, past 2 old men who just sipped coffee and nodded like this sort of thing happened every Tuesday. I tried to chase her down, but it was like trying to catch a paper airplane in a windstorm. She darted through people's legs, knocked over a stack of onions, and licked a toddler's arm before hopping neatly up the bakery steps and disappearing inside. By the time I got there, the baker was holding a loaf of bread above his head, like it was a weapon, and Eleni was calmly standing on a flour sack, nibbling what looked suspiciously like my grandfather's peach. "You brought your circus," he said to me in Greek. "She doesn't like being alone," I explained, holding out my hands. To my surprise, Eleni walked right over, nuzzled her nose into my shirt, and gave a small, contented huff. Like this was all perfectly normal. And maybe in a way it was. By the end of the week, she was a fixture in the square. The baker started leaving stale rolls out for her. The old men by the coffee stall began calling her the little lady, and the kids from the neighboring streets. They tried to get her to follow them too, but she never did. Only me. I started talking to her when we walked. Not in full conversations, just little remarks. "Don't eat that," or "That's someone's laundry," or "Please stop chewing my cousin's homework." She never replied, of course, but she'd give me this look. Like, "You think you're in charge? That's adorable." One evening, we sat by the well as the sun dipped behind the hills, turning the whole village gold. Eleni lay beside me, chewing on a stalk of dry grass. I leaned back against the stone inside. "You're not like the other goats," I whispered. She snorted. I swear it was the exact kind of snort someone makes when they think you're being overly sentimental. But still, I meant it. She wasn't. Theo tried to convince me to teach her tricks, make her dance, or fetch something, he said. But Eleni wasn't a circus goat. She didn't want to perform. She just wanted to be there. And being there beside me in the slow haze of that summer was more than enough. There was one moment I'll never forget. It was a quiet afternoon, one of those days where everything felt slightly too warm and too slow. I was reading again, lying flat on my stomach in the shade, and Eleni curled herself next to me, her back touching mine. No chewing, no exploring, just quiet company. It was strange, the kind of comfort she brought. Not loud, not even especially affectionate, but grounding. Like she reminded me to slow down, to notice things, the way the breeze made the olive leaves shimmer, or how the stone walls held onto the sun for hours. At night she'd sleep just outside the house, right beneath the grapevine trellis. My grandfather said goats were clever like that, they always picked the most peaceful spot. I started bringing her a little piece of fruit each morning. Not too much, she was a goat after all, but enough to let her know I noticed her. And she noticed me. That summer we didn't need words. We just needed each other. It was inevitable, really. A goat that followed me everywhere, who already had a bit of a flair for drama, was bound to escalate things eventually. And Eleni, despite her calm exterior, had a very mischievous heart. It began with bread, always the bread. There was a woman in the village named Katerina who sold long sesame-covered loaves from a cloth-lined basket she carried on her head. She'd circle the square twice each morning, calling out, "Show me ze stop so me." Hot bread. Eleni adored Katerina, or more specifically, Katerina's basket. One morning we were sitting by the steps of the old church. I was drawing shapes in the dust with a stick. Eleni lay beside me, tail flicking gently. All was peaceful, until Katerina walked by. Eleni's ears twitched. Before I could blink, she was up and trotting after her. Not running, just casually creeping forward like a very fluffy criminal. "Eleni," I hissed, dropping my stick. Katerina kept walking, unaware of the goat tailing her. The basket swayed with every step, and Eleni kept time like a musician. At one point, she stood on her hind legs trying to get a sniff. That's when the disaster happened. The basket tipped. In a beautifully slow-motion moment, 3 loaves tumbled down like golden comets. One landed in the gutter, another rolled into the shadow of a cart, the third right at Eleni's hooves. She did not hesitate, snatched it up, bolted across the square, and disappeared into the alley like she'd planned the whole thing. I ran after her, apologizing in 5 directions at once. By the time I found her, she was crouched behind the fig tree, nibbling with wild-eyed glee. Breadcrumbs all over her muzzle. She looked completely unrepentant. I sat beside her and sighed. "You're going to get us exiled." From that day on, the square became a stage, and Eleni was the main act. She didn't steal again exactly, but she loitered, brazenly. The townspeople learned to expect her. If a door was open, she'd peek in. If someone dropped a shopping list, she'd chew on it. A boy tried to give her a ribbon once, and she ran off with it trailing from her horn like some kind of tiny royal. One afternoon, she wandered into the taverna during lunch. I chased her inside and found her standing on the threshold, staring at the fish menu chalked on the wall. A man looked up from his soup and said without missing a beat, "Tell her the sardines are too salty today." We left in embarrassment, of course, but laughter followed us out. Even Theo, who tried very hard to remain unimpressed by my goat friend, admitted she had charm. He once claimed she was cursed, maybe the reincarnation of a naughty monk or an escaped actor from the old amphitheater. "She knows too much," he whispered, watching her watch us. And maybe he was right. Eleni had an uncanny sense of timing. If we were trying to sneak into the orchard, she'd suddenly block the path with perfect comedic timing. If we dared to climb the crumbling stairs of the watchtower, she'd bleat once loudly and alert the gardener. She was a tiny hoofed enigma, but never mean-spirited, just complicated. One of my favorite days came in late July. The village had a celebration, something to do with a saint whose name I never learned to pronounce. flags strung between buildings, a band of old men playing fiddles and bouzoukis, long tables filled with dolmas, grilled corn, and jugs of sharp lemonade. Eleni came too. No one tried to stop her. She wandered from table to table, sniffed every dish, and even tried to join the circle of dancers before becoming distracted by a tambourine. A little girl, maybe 5 years old, gently patted Eleni's back and whispered something to her. Eleni sat down beside her like she understood. And that's when I knew. She wasn't just my goat anymore. She belonged to the village. The baker who pretended to scold her, he snuck her sesame crusts when no one was looking. The priest's wife left cabbage stems on the wall for her. Even Katerina, whose bread she had once stolen, shook her head fondly when she passed. She's got the devil's eyes, she said, but also the virgin's patience. I didn't know what that meant, but it sounded just right. Still, she always came back to me. At dusk, when the air cooled and the cicadas fell silent, I'd find her curled up beside the steps of the house. Waiting, always waiting. I'd sit next to her with my arms around my knees and talk softly about the day. She never interrupted, just listened. And maybe that's what made her the best friend I didn't know I needed. She listened better than most people ever do. Summer days in the village had a rhythm. You woke up with the light, ate something fresh and simple, figs, bread, cheese, and let the day stretch out like a lazy cat across the warm stones. The afternoons were for hiding in the shade, and the evenings for sitting outside, fanning yourself with a folded newspaper and watching the world hum along. Eleni became part of that rhythm, like the sun, like the smells of roasted garlic and distant ocean, like the way the crickets seemed to get louder just before sunset. She was simply there. But with that constancy came stubbornness. If I tried to leave without her, she would stand by the door and refuse to move. One time I climbed over the back wall, thinking I could escape for a quick errand to the well. She was waiting for me. When I got back, chewing on my sock like a protest sign. Theo found it hilarious. She's imprinting, he said like a scientist. You're her goat now. And maybe he was right. I stopped trying to shake her. Instead, we leaned into the partnership. I tied a little bell to her collar, a soft copper thing I found in my grandfather's workshop. It rang gently when she walked, like a secret sound only I could hear. She followed me to the fields, to the churchyard, even to the old cemetery where the marble stones stood crooked like broken piano keys. She wasn't spooked by anything. Not the owls, not the wind that sometimes whispered through the alleyways, not even the neighbor's grumpy rooster who attacked flip-flops like they owed him money. She became a kind of legend. People would spot us walking, me barefoot, Eleni trotting behind with a grape leaf hanging from her mouth, and they'd shake their heads in mock disapproval. A boy and his goat, someone would mutter. The village is doomed. But they smiled when they said it. My grandfather, a man of few words and even fewer facial expressions, began saving scraps from his lunch for her. He called her the white thief. She never stole from him, only accepted what he offered quietly with a respectful flick of the ear. One evening he told me, in the old days we believed goats could see things we couldn't. Spirits, luck, weather. I nodded even though I wasn't sure what to say. She sees you, he added. That's rare. The next morning I decided to take her somewhere new. A little grove of fig trees tucked behind the hills where the grass grew tall and nobody ever bothered us. I had a plan, a foolish, wonderful plan. I was going to teach Eleni to steal figs, not for mischief, for teamwork. We crept out early before Theo woke up, before the baker had even fired up his oven. The world was soft and gray-blue like it had just been washed. The fig trees were heavy with fruit drooping like they were trying to whisper secrets to the ground. I picked a few low-hanging ones and held them out. Eleni stared. Look, I said, gently pressing one to her nose. Fig. Delicious, forbidden. You want it. She sniffed, licked, and eventually took it with a tiny crunch. Success. Then came the training. I'd point to a branch, make a clicking sound, and wait. She'd stare at me like I'd lost my mind. But by the fourth or fifth try, she began to understand. She'd reach up, tug with her lips, and pull down a fig like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Good girl," I whispered. "Now run before the gardener sees us." We did this almost every morning. It became a secret ritual. We never took too many, just a few soft and bursting eaten under the shade, while ants marched by and bees hovered above. I even taught her to stand still while I climbed on her back to reach a higher branch. She didn't love that part, but she tolerated it. For me. One day we got caught. The gardener, an old man with a limp and a hat shaped like a mushroom, spotted us mid-heist. He raised his arms in mock fury, shouted something about goat bandits, and I panicked. Took off running. Eleni didn't move. She stared at him. He stared at her. Then he laughed. A deep belly laugh that made birds fly out of the trees. "You've got a clever one," he said as I crept back red-faced. "She's learning," I mumbled. He handed me 2 figs from his pocket. "Then teach her not to take the green ones." From then on, he left a little basket at the edge of the grove. Ripe figs. No more sneaking. It wasn't about the fruit, really. It was about the joy of sharing something secret and small with someone who didn't speak but always understood. That summer, Eleni and I became a team. Not because we had to, but because it felt right. Like the world had paused just long enough for a goat and a boy to understand each other completely. The weather changed suddenly, as it often does in old villages, nestled between sea and hill. One morning, the breeze that usually carried the scent of sun-warmed rosemary turned cooler, heavier. The sky, once a bright, unbothered blue, dimmed slightly, just a smudge of gray at the edge of the horizon. My grandfather said storms rolled in from the north this time of year, and if you listened closely, you could hear the wind before it reached the olive trees. I didn't listen. That day, Theo and I had planned one last fig mission with Eleni. She was by this point an expert. She didn't even wait for me to point anymore. She'd sniff out the ripest ones, nudge them down with her forehead, and munch them with the kind of satisfaction that makes you jealous. But as we walked toward the grove, I noticed something different. The air had that metallic edge, not cold but charged, like the sky was holding its breath. Eleni stopped walking halfway up the hill. She sniffed the ground, then the sky, then turned back toward the village. I thought maybe she was bored, or just being her usual difficult self. "Come on," I said, patting her side. She didn't move. Theo squinted up at the clouds. "I think she knows something." I laughed. "Like what?" "That we're late for our crime spree." But Eleni didn't laugh. She gave a short, low bleat, almost like a warning. Then she walked in the opposite direction, slowly but deliberately down the hill toward home. We should have followed her. Instead, we pressed on, picked figs, talked nonsense. Theo tried to balance on a rock and nearly twisted his ankle. Normal things, but the sky kept getting darker. It happened fast. One minute the wind was just a breeze. The next it was full of grit and broken leaves howling through the olive branches like something ancient had just woken up. We ran. By the time we made it back to the village, the rain was already falling in heavy, angry sheets. Theo darted toward his house, slipping on the cobblestones. I burst through our front door soaked and panting. And then I realized something. Eleni wasn't there. At first I wasn't worried. Maybe she had found shelter. Maybe she was already curled up under the grapevine, waiting for the storm to pass. But the courtyard was empty. No muddy hoofprints, no soft bell chime, no familiar white shape huddled near the wall. "Have you seen Eleni?" I asked my grandfather, trying to sound calm. He looked up from his radio. "Not since morning." We waited. An hour passed, then another. The storm didn't stop. Thunder rolled through the hills, shaking the shutters. The electricity flickered once, then gave up completely. Candlelight painted the walls gold, but it didn't warm me. I stood by the window, forehead pressed to the cool glass, listening, hoping. I even called her name into the wind. Nothing. That night was the longest of the summer. I couldn't sleep. I imagined her caught in the olive groves, or worse, slipping near the cliffs alone and confused. I kept replaying her warning bleat in my head. She had known. Somehow, she had known. The next morning was silent. The storm had passed, but everything felt muted, like the village had forgotten how to breathe. I put on my sandals and headed out before anyone else was awake. I checked the grove, first empty except for scattered branches and fig leaves plastered to the ground like soggy confetti. Then the watchtower, the well, even the broken fountain by the cemetery. No Eleni. The village began to stir. People swept water from their doorways. The baker relit his oven. A rooster crowed very late, as if embarrassed. Still no one had seen her. By midday, I was sitting by the old stone bridge, legs dangling over the edge, wondering if I'd see her again. That's when I heard it, a sound I hadn't heard in a day. The soft, unmistakable jingle of a tiny copper bell. I froze. It was faint, distant, barely real. But it was there. I stood up, heart racing, and turned toward the sound. And then I ran. I ran faster than I ever had before. Down the winding slope behind the vineyard, past the collapsed fence that creaked in the wind, and through a patch of wild fennel that slapped against my legs like soft green brushes. The bell sound was getting louder, still faint but steady. It was coming from the grove. Of course, the grove. The place we had spent so many quiet mornings. The place where she had learned to steal figs and chew them with smug little grunts of victory. I should have checked there sooner. Maybe she'd gone back during the storm. Maybe she'd waited for me. I slipped once, landing hard on my hip, but scrambled up and kept going. The trees came into view, swaying gently now, like they too had survived the night and were settling back into themselves. Then I saw her. At first, just a flash of white between the branches. Then her shape unmistakable, small, muddy, but standing. The copper bell around her neck glinted once in the filtered light. "Eleni," I shouted louder than I meant to. She turned her head slowly, as if to say, "Took you long enough." I rushed forward, stumbling over roots and fallen branches, and dropped to my knees beside her. She didn't run, didn't nudge or bleat or do anything dramatic. She just stood there looking at me with those golden, calm eyes, as if everything was completely normal. She was wet, of course, her fur clumped with dried mud and bits of leaf, but otherwise unharmed. Her hoof was slightly swollen, maybe from a small sprain, but she wasn't limping badly. And somehow she had ended up exactly where we used to go together, where things felt safe. I sat down next to her, panting, soaked with sweat and grass stains. We were both quiet for a long while. Birds chirped hesitantly above, and a breeze carried the sharp scent of wet fig and earth. "Why'd you run off?" I asked, though I already knew. She didn't trust the weather. She tried to warn me. I didn't listen. I gently touched her ear and scratched behind it, right where she liked. She leaned into my hand and gave a long, slow exhale. Not quite a sigh, more like relief. "I thought I lost you," I whispered. That night we walked home slowly. I took off my shirt and wrapped it around her belly just to dry her off a bit and keep the chill away. She didn't complain. Her hooves clopped softly on the path bell, jingling in time with my footsteps. When we got back to the house, my grandfather didn't say anything. He just opened the gate, gave Eleni a long, assessing look, and nodded once. Then he reached behind the door and pulled out something I hadn't seen in years, his old wooden flute. It had been years since he played it, at least publicly. It was a long, worn thing, carved with strange swirls and tiny faded symbols. He never explained where it came from, but my mother once said he used to play it when she was a child late at night to calm the animals. He sat on the step, legs stretched in front of him, and began to play. It wasn't a song exactly, more like a wandering tune that slipped between notes like water down old stone. High and low, soft and slow, It filled the air with something I couldn't quite name. Something old. Something from the hills and the sea and the sun-drenched ruins. Eleni stopped eating her cabbage scrap and looked up. Her ears flicked toward him. Then she walked slowly over and curled beside his foot, resting her chin on his sandal as the melody continued. I watched sitting in the doorway with my arms around my knees. That moment, faded candlelight, soft music, a muddy goat, and a quiet old man, I'll never forget it. It felt like the world was holding its breath, like the storm had come just to make space for this. The flute quieted. The final note hung in the air a moment longer than seemed possible. Then silence. Eleni closed her eyes. Grandpa didn't say a word, just stood, brushed off his pants, and went inside. I stayed outside with her for hours. We didn't move. She didn't need to. Everything was still again. By the next morning, the village was whispering. She returned with the storm, someone said. The old flute still works, another chuckled. No one asked too many questions. That's how it is in places like that. When strange things happen, people nod, sip their coffee, and carry on. But I knew. She came back because of him, because of the song, because maybe somewhere in that old goat heart of hers she knew where home was. And maybe, just maybe, the flute helped her find her way. After that stormy night, everything changed, not just for me, but for Eleni too. The village already loved her in that grudging, amused way people love eccentric uncles or opinionated bakers. But now she was famous. She came back from the storm, they said. She listens to music. She followed the sound of the old man's flute like a spell. It didn't matter whether any of it was true. In small villages, stories grow legs faster than goats do. Eleni became something between a pet, a mystery, and a minor local celebrity. People started leaving little treats for her, a dish of barley near the church steps, a handful of melon rinds behind the bakery. The baker who once threatened to make a stew out of her now called her Kyria Eleni, Madame Eleni. He even chalked her name on the menu board one morning as a joke. Today's special leftover crust for Madame Eleni. But for all her growing reputation, she still chose me. Each morning she was there by the door, hooves clicking softly on the stone as I tied my sandals. She walked beside me like nothing had ever happened. Like the storm, the disappearance, and the return had just been a little interlude in our otherwise predictable routine. And I appreciated that. After all, summer was drawing to a close. You can always tell when August begins to lose its heat. The sunlight becomes just a little more golden. The evenings cool faster. The figs grow softer. People start saying things like, just a few more weeks or next summer, without realizing how final those words sound. I tried not to think about leaving. Instead, I soaked in the last days. Eleni and I returned to the grove one more time. We didn't take anything. Just sat in the sun beneath the largest tree, her head resting on my thigh, eyes half closed. Theo came with us that time. He didn't bring his usual teasing mood. Instead, he sat a little apart, tossing pebbles at a distant rock. After a while, he asked, "You think she'll remember you?" I didn't answer. That night, I began gathering my things. My mother was already folding clothes into her suitcase. My father wrapped glass jars in dish towels. My grandparents stayed quiet, sitting out under the grapevine trellis, as if they too were pretending it wasn't almost over. Eleni watched all of it. She didn't fuss, didn't whine or try to follow me into the house, but she stayed close, close enough to touch. That last evening, my grandfather brought out the flute again. This time he didn't sit. He just played one long, slow melody near the front steps while we all listened, soft breeze ruffling the vines above. Eleni stood at attention the whole time, tail still, eyes fixed on him, like he held some invisible thread between them. The next morning we packed the car. There's something especially sad about leaving a place where you didn't just live, you belonged. I looked back at the house, the vines, the cracked paint around the windows. the dusty steps where I'd sat with Eleni so many times. And there she was, standing exactly where she had stood on that first day, quiet, unmoving, her copper bell catching the sun like a little star. I walked over and knelt down. She didn't nuzzle, didn't bleat, just stared at me in that serene, all-knowing way goats sometimes do. I reached out and scratched behind her ears. "Thanks for the figs," I whispered. Then I did something strange. I took off my wristband, a faded green one I'd worn all summer, frayed and stained with fig juice and sun, and I looped it gently over her horn. "Something to remember me by," I said. She blinked once, and then just before I turned to go, she did something she'd never done before. She licked my nose. It was quick, rough, unexpected, and oddly perfect. Theo nearly fell over laughing. "She does love you," he shouted from the car. I didn't say anything, just smiled and climbed in. As we pulled away, I looked out the back window. Eleni was still there, still calm, still Eleni. And though I don't know if she stayed in that exact spot after we left, or whether she wandered back to the grove, or if someone else eventually tried to win her loyalty with sweet melon rinds and fig slices, I do know this. That goat was never just a goat. She was part of my summer, part of my story, part of that soft, flickering memory that still smells like dust lemon and old music. And somewhere in a quiet village where the stone steps still hum with late afternoon sun, a little white goat with a green cloth around her horn still wanders through the figs waiting for her boy to come home. The weeks after we returned home felt strange. I kept waking up expecting to hear the soft clang of a copper bell or the thud of tiny hooves outside the window. Instead, there was the sound of early buses humming appliances and the clink of cereal bowls in a tiled kitchen. No fig trees, no cracked stone walls, no Eleni. It was hard to explain to my friends. Back home, we lived in a neighborhood with neatly trimmed hedges and weekly garbage pickup. Pets were mostly cats, golden retrievers, or goldfish that swam in slow, tired circles. When I told one friend I'd spent the summer with a goat, he laughed and asked if I had finally lost my mind. Maybe I had. I missed her more than I expected. It wasn't just the companionship, it was the ritual. The way she turned every walk into an adventure, every quiet moment into something full of possibility. And in her own odd way, she'd taught me something about stillness, about paying attention, about how even a fig chewed slowly in the shade could feel like a celebration. School began again as it always did. My shoes felt tighter. The air smelled like books and pencil shavings. I went through the motions: homework, soccer, after-school snacks, but everything felt slightly less real than that summer. I wrote letters to my grandparents every other week. My grandfather didn't reply often, but when he did, his handwriting danced unevenly across the paper like it was resisting the lines. In October, I received a small package. Inside was a photograph. It was grainy and faded, printed on thick, glossy paper. It showed Eleni standing beside the front steps, head tilted with something looped around her horn, a green cloth bracelet frayed and sun-bleached but still there. On the back of the photo, in my grandmother's careful cursive, it simply said, "She's waiting." I stared at the picture for a long time. Then I pinned it to the corkboard above my bed, right next to the drawing I'd made of her under the fig tree. I added a little note beneath it in pencil: "Don't forget who you are in summer." Winter came, snow fell, life moved on. She never really left me. Years later, I returned to the village. Taller, older, different, but the stones were still warm. The vine still curled over the trellis. The baker still shouted about flour like it was currency. And as I walked through the narrow alleys, a familiar sound reached me from somewhere beyond the fig trees. The gentle, distant chime of a copper bell. I didn't run this time. I just walked slowly, smiling as the sun dipped behind the hills. Whether it was Eleni or her great-great-grandkid or just the memory echoing back through time, I didn't care. Some friendships don't fade. They just grow quieter. And maybe if you sit still enough, if you listen closely enough, if you let yourself sink into the rhythm of old stone villages and fig-stained mornings, you'll hear them again. Not as shouts, but as whispers. And now as you lie there with your eyes gently closed, let your breath slow your thoughts soften. Picture the fading light of a Greek summer evening, casting long shadows across a dusty courtyard. The air is warm, still holding on to the heat of the sun, and somewhere nearby you hear the delicate jingle of a small copper bell. The scent of fig leaves drifts through the air, sweet, earthy, familiar. You feel the weight of the day melting away like dew evaporating from the stones. The world grows quieter with every passing moment. You can almost feel the worn cobblestones beneath your feet and the soft brush of a curious goat leaning against your leg, content and calm. In the distance, the slow, wistful notes of an old wooden flute begin to play. They rise and fall gently like waves lapping against the edge of memory. It's the kind of music that doesn't ask for attention. It just exists, quietly filling the spaces between your thoughts, smoothing out every wrinkle in your day. As you breathe in, imagine the stillness of a fig grove at sunset. As you breathe out, let go of whatever you've carried with you. You're not in a hurry. You're not expected anywhere. You're simply here resting in this soft space between waking and dreaming. Eleni is near. She always is. And somewhere tucked away in the hills of your imagination, she's still waiting under the fig trees, watching the stars come out one by one. Sleep well, dear listener. You're home. End of script. Sweet dreams.